Hello, everyone, and welcome to another uh, audio podcast. This is an audio podcast on the series the LabZtorm critique and on the topic that will be that's being discussed: elucidation of biochemical and hematological parameters in chronic kidney disease patients. This is a collaboration between the ZtormLabostix production and the Renal Patient Support Group, or the RPSG, and this is the scientist. And today I'm going to give an overview of this particular subject by highlighting this topic by reading just an overview of the abstract that was published, where this work was published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2016, and this in a journal titled Annals of Clinical and Laboratory Research, and the abstract is as thus. End-stage renal disease is a progressive disorder for which there is no prospect of recovery, and for which patients receive regular or routine hemodialysis. In end-stage renal disease, the ability of the kidneys to excrete metabolic waste products and to regulate the composition of extracellular fluid is compromised. Symptoms of end-stage renal disease also include cardiovascular dysfunction, anemia, malnutrition, muscle wasting, muscle weakness, glucose intolerance, and reduced bone density. Patients with end-stage renal disease are likely to be challenged by participation in physical activity or whilst undergoing a hemodialysis regimen. Nevertheless, there is a case for prescribing where patients undertake physical activity based on some baseline guidance, and in relating to this, where they might struggle to become active in sort of a worst case scenarios. So some benefits of physical activities in patients receiving hemodialysis or on a hemodialysis regimen. The benefits of physical activity can include, but not restricted to the following. So there's number one, there's a reduction of toxins and fluid overload in the circulatory system, permitting improved tolerance to the hemodialysis regimen. And number two, increased heart rate, which improves cardiovascular performance. Number three, a reduction in comorbidities and an increase in well-being. And four, the facilitation of positive coping strategies, and as such. An understanding of how physical activity can be of clinical advantage in end-stage renal disease patients is unique and challenging, given the variety of nutritional and clinical conditions with which they present with. The hematological and biochemical parameters which should be monitored in these patients, including blood potassium, urea, calcium, and hemoglobin levels need to be prioritized or should be prioritized, and this proliferation depends in turn upon general patient well-being. More research in this context is also required in the understanding of physiology and the importance of good, good health and well-being in this population in relating to these biochemical and hematological parameters. Now, in this work, their aim was to provide some background of the key the main biochemical and hematological parameters which are affected during physical activity in hemodialysis patients, in actual hemodialysis patients. This results The results help to in this work, the author highlights the result helps to emphasize that closer attention should be paid to monitoring hemodialysis efficacy hemodialysis treatment efficacy, and what's referred to as the KT/V calculation as a measure of dialysis adequacy between those pre and post physical activity, and the works this work aims to provide some background on some of those the main hematological and biochemical parameters, and also the author concludes that looks to conclude that closer attention needs to be made to monitoring the hemodialysis regimen and efficacy, and in line with what happens or takes place through the through hematology, and as a result of the hematological and biochemical parameters. The peer review publication actually highlights parameters around, for example, urea, potassium, calcium, and areas around, at least from biochemistry perspective, and then aspects around diet and physical activity and health perception, diet and nutrition, and there is some focus on the hematological parameters, of course. So some of the main concerns around hematology are sort of focused in this peer review publication, focusing on how there is compromised hematology in hemodialysis patients, for example, where there's evidence of anemia, reduced erythropoietin stimulation, issues around iron deficiency, or blood loss, potential blood loss. There can be folate abnormalities, particularly in female hemodialysis patients, abnormal platelet function potentially, thrombocytopenia or low platelet count potentially as well, and issues around thrombosis and polycythemia, as well as some cases of where there is issues around specific hematological parameters in some renal patient categories versus other renal patient categories, according to the diagnosis of the kind of or the form of renal disease that patients are diagnosed with as well. So this work highlights all of that context in sort of a robust peer review publication. I'm just going to end with this, and that is to say, the immune system also plays a role, a function, with most patients having who can have sort of other health concerns, depending on how well they sort of get on with the hemodialysis regimen. Has an important stance as well. It is important to have to see that there is more research that associates physical activity with endocrinology in patients with end-stage renal disease, i.e. to understand how hemodialysis patients and their parameters are affected with sort of psychological stress, and, for example, the endocrine system in regard to beta endorphins or endorphin, and certainly more longitudinal cross-sectional investigations are required to inform future care and healthcare practices. That's it, listeners, and I'm going to leave it like that on this particular audio podcast. This has been another ZtormLabostix production in collaboration with the Renal Patient Support Group and the RPSG. This has been an overview on the topic elucidation of biochemical and hematological parameters in chronic kidney disease patients on the series on the series audio podcast series, the LabZtorm critique, and this has been the LabZtorm the LabZtorm effect v.2. Thank you for listening.